How to turn a quick little sketch model like this into something like this. So before starting this piece, I went through my box of random miniature things trying to spark some inspiration, and I found these. Finding all these different pieces triggered an idea in me, and using some scrap piece of foam board, I decided to start sketch modeling. This is the usual process I go through when building a miniature piece, just because I'm able to get an idea of what I want something to look like before actually making the final decisions. This is sort of like the design stage, where you're able to try out different ideas, see what works and what doesn't. Once you're happy with your rough model, it's time to start the real thing. I started by cutting some equidistant lines along a piece of 5mm foam board, giving it the ability to bend and curve. Then, using the bent piece of foam board as a guide, I was able to mark out where and how I needed to cut the back wall. Once that's done, I attached the two pieces of wool together and added a floor using some foam packaging I had lying around. Now once the base structure is all done, I decided to add a layer of polyfiller over the whole thing. I did this for two reasons. One being that it adds an overall texture to the piece, which will come in very handy when painting. And two, I knew I wanted to use resin on this piece from the start, so by using polyfiller I was able to seal the base structure, making sure there won't be any leaks. Once the polyfiller was dry, I added a healthy coat of primer and started the process of airbrushing. Now this process here is all about layering. As you can see, I'm starting off with a lighter tone just to catch highlights and just to differentiate between the greys, making sure the piece doesn't look too flat or monotone. Once you're happy with the tonal differences on the piece, it's time to start adding some colour. And this is when you can start getting a little bit more creative with what you pick. I went for more of a green tone due to the fact that we're doing a sewer, and I thought that a moss-like green would work well as a background colour. A good tip for when you're trying to make something look aged or dirty is to know where age and dirt builds up, which is usually in the corners or on the edges between the wall and the floor, areas that don't really have much foot traffic. Highlighting these areas early on is a good idea, as it gives you a roadmap to where the age and dirt will spread. As you can see, at this stage you can still make some mistakes. I just had to knock back some of the airbrushing I did as I wasn't too happy with it. So don't worry if there are any mistakes at this point, because the aim really at this stage is to create a backdrop for the rest of your set. Once you're happy with the base, it's time to add the structural details. Using some gunmetal spray paint, I painted all the individual pieces that I will later add to the set. For anything that has that dark metallic look, gunmetal spray paint is probably the best, as it allows for you to have that metallic shine without it being too bright or silvery. Once everything is sprayed and dried, it's time to attach it to the actual set. Luckily we know where everything needs to go, as we planned this out in an earlier stage of the project. For certain pieces, like the pipes, I didn't want them to just be glued onto the face of the wall, so using a scalpel I was able to chip away at some of the polyfiller and insert the pipes, giving it that more realistic look. Once I knew that inserting the pipes into the wall was the way forward, I then repeated this process to every bit of drainage or pipe that I wanted to add onto the walls. Once that was all added and I was happy with how the structure was looking, it was time to add the decals. Now this part is one of my favourite parts of making a miniature. I'm not sure why, but once these get added, it really does increase that realism and makes it feel like a proper lived-in environment. I always cut out way more than I need, because when placing them into the environment, it's always good to try out different variations to really see what feels right. Once you're happy with the placement, you can glue everything in. Then, using a paintbrush and some watery brown, go over the whole piece again with another layer of aging. You can do this by adding streaks coming down from the ceiling as well as certain pipes, and also by again highlighting those areas where that age and dirt really builds up. As you can see, once we've added that extra layer of aging, the whole piece just looks like it has a lot more depth and life to it. Once that's all done and you're happy with the way everything looks, it's time for the really fun part, creating a resin toxic lake. Now before we can start pouring the resin, we need to create a sealed environment for the resin to sit in and cure without leaking out. To do this, I used some acetate sheets that I had lying around, and initially I wanted to use some white tack to create a sealed edge, but that wasn't really working out, so instead I just used some super glue and added some dots along the edge, which worked perfectly. And then, as a precaution, I added a thin layer of UV resin along the whole thing to make sure it's perfectly sealed. Once that's all ready, it's time to start mixing and pouring the resin. I initially wanted to use some regular resin that would cure within about 12 hours, but unfortunately the resin I had ordered hadn't arrived, so I ended up using some UV resin instead. Now this ended up being a blessing in disguise, as during the early parts of pouring the resin, I was trying to pinpoint what colour I wanted the toxic lake to be, and the fact that I was layering up different colours and curing each time, it created this kaleidoscope of neon green that really worked well. And once I noticed this, I leant into it head first, purposefully mixing different tones of green and pouring them in at the same time, hoping to create a gradient between the darker tones and the lighter tones. I then manually mixed into the resin until I had a pattern that I was happy with. Now this resulted from a bunch of trial and error, so please don't forget to try out different techniques because you never know what the end result might be. Moving on from the resin for a little bit, I decided to add some extra detailing to the piece by gluing some wires along the bottom edge. This I feel like just again adds an extra layer of detail. I then started to think about what I could put into the toxic lake, and in homage of one of the residents of the sewer, I decided to use a pizza box, specifically a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles pizza box. I was able to find this decal online pretty easily just on Google, and I printed it off, layered it onto some card, and then cut it into a box-like pattern. I then folded and glued the box in place and added it to the lake, along with an oil drum that I had lying about from another model and a danger sign. I then added another layer of resin over the whole thing just to make sure that everything looked like it was sinking into it, and I also discovered another little technique by adding dots of resin and hardening them, making it look like the lake was bubbling. Now it's time to add resin to the pipes. I attached some clear acrylic rods to the pipes and then layer by layer added the resin, creating the illusion that toxic waste was literally dripping and pouring out of these pipes. I then decided to do some extra set dressing with this resin by adding it into certain little areas that I feel like it would build up naturally, such as the vents and on the floor underneath the drainage pipes. Again, adding further layers of detail, building out the story of this set, and making sure that if someone looks at it, no matter where they look at, they'll always have a little detail that will pop out. Admittedly, I was having way too much fun with the UV resin. I think I used more resin on this piece than I've used on any other piece that I've made. I was just enjoying seeing which techniques would give out which outcomes, and I'll definitely be using resin again on a future project. Once I was finished with all the resin and knew I wasn't going to add any more, I proceeded to remove the acrylic sheeting. Then, for some extra detailing, I added some 3D printed miniature rats as well as some 3D printed miniature turtles. And there it is! That's how you make a miniature realistic toxic sewer. Please like, subscribe and share this video, comment down below what you want to see me make next, check out any other videos I have on my channel at the moment, and stay tuned for the next one.